In the first video in this series, I explained what a digital certificate is and why we use them. In the next video, I explain how TLS, aka SSL, uses an X509 certificate to authenticate the server, allowing clients to trust it. At the end of the video, I pointed out that X509 certificates can also be used to authenticate the client. Given the high security provided by client certificates, you might expect them to be used everywhere. There are, however, some challenges to overcome when you decide to use them. To understand the trade-offs, you need to understand the whole picture. So here is TLS certificates from the beginning.
Let's start at the very beginning.
Stop that! You're not going into a song while I'm here.
When we talk about authentication, most people think of logging in with a username and password. But in TLS, the very first authentication actually goes the other way. The server proves who it is to the client using an X509 certificate. That certificate is the foundation of trust on the internet. Without it, you'd have no idea if you were really talking to your bank or to an attacker pretending to be your bank. But the thing is, servers have secrets to protect too. That's why applications also need to authenticate you. In the first video, I explained that X509 was originally designed to be tie a key pair to a person's identity, not a server's, a person's. And that hasn't gone away. X509 certificates can still be used to authenticate people, or in terms of a TLS connection, the client. The server starts a TLS connection by sending its certificate. The client then validates that it is legitimately talking to the server it was trying to reach. I explained all of this in more detail in the last video. After that, the server can say, "Hey client, I want you to prove who you are too." At this point, the client has an opportunity to identify itself. In most cases, the server doesn't ask, so the client doesn't have an opportunity to send a certificate. But let's look at a site that does ask for a client certificate. badssl.com is a site that demonstrates TLS functionality. It lets you explore how different TLS scenarios work, or don't work, as the case may be. You can visit client.badssl.com, and you'll get a 400 error complaining that you did not send a client certificate. Chances are you don't have a client certificate to send. I actually do, as I need them for work, but I still got a 400 error. This is because since TLS 1.2, the client certificate request lists the certificate authorities that the server trusts for client certificates. You used to be able to send whatever client certificates you might have, but now you need to send one from the list of acceptable CAs. So let's look at the client certificate requests that badssl sends. The highlighted part says badssl client root certificate authority. The certificates that I already have were signed by someone else. Luckily, you can download a client certificate signed by the badssl certificate authority and install it on your system. It includes links and directions in the description. Once you have that, your browser will ask you whether or not you want to send it. And then you can successfully complete the request. Let's look at how the server TLS stack validated our certificate. When the server receives the client certificate, it performs most of the same checks that we talked about in the last video. Is it signed by a trusted CA? Has it expired? Was it revoked? Is it flagged for client authentication? But here's the twist. With the server certificate, the TLS stack goes one step further and checks the name. Does this certificate really match example.com? For client certificates, the TLS stack doesn't do that. Once it confirms the certificate is valid and trusted, it's finished. This makes sense because when you connect to a server, you're going to a specific location. In this case, TLS stack can help verify that you're connecting to that location. When you're getting certificates from clients, they could come from any number of identities. The TLS stack has no idea which ones are or are not authorized to access the application. It's the application's job to decide what that identity can access, if anything. The badssl client certificate test, for example, probably doesn't check anything about the identity. After all, it just needs to demonstrate a working TLS connection that asks for a client certificate. Furthermore, the site has only ever issued one valid certificate. So in this case, the application doesn't need to go beyond what the TLS stack already checked. You'll see this pattern in some zero-trust architectures where the goal is simply to separate legitimate client from unauthorized outsider. But most applications need finer-grained control. Not everyone with a valid certificate should have the same privileges or even access to the same systems. That's when you start looking inside the certificate itself. You can use any of its fields for authorization decisions, but the most common starting point is the client's distinguished name. As the term implies, the distinguished name, or DN, is a name that singles out a specific identity. For users, it includes their name, called the common name, and other attributes which disambiguate their identity. This may include their location, their organizational membership, or whatever is needed to guarantee that a DN is unique within the set of certificates signed by a CA. If you look at this list of sample DNs, you'll see there's a lot of different possible ways an identity can express a DN. While the name in the certificate is the most obvious element to use for authorization, there are some elements found in the subject alternate name, or SAN, list that are frequently used. A site might identify users from their email address, and nodes in a service mesh might use a URI containing an ID from the Secure Production Identity Framework for Everyone, or SPIFFE. SPIFFE is a set of standards used to secure distributed systems. Whether or not a certificate has these attributes or even specifies what's in the DN are up to the certificate authority. Looking back at the list of example DNs, you can imagine that a system looking for one of these formats would not find what it needs from a different format. The second example on the screen has a UID as a component of the DN, whereas the third example appends an ID number to the common name. None of the other examples include an ID number, although it might be in the SAN. This is why they added the ability for a server to restrict which certificate authorities it will recognize. This allows the server to set expectations for what it should find in the distinguished name or the subject alternate name. This raises the question, what are your options for certificate authorities? Today, people have all kinds of IDs. For those of us concerned with website security, it would be really convenient if we could reasonably expect that at least one of these IDs would include a digital certificate. People who live in Estonia or Belgium already have this. Digital certificates are contained in the chips embedded in their national ID cards. In most other countries, this is not the case. So what is another option? Another option is to use established certificate authorities like DigiCert or IdenTrust, among many others, that sell personal X509 certificates. Some are inexpensive or even free, but they only offer certificates tagged for use in email security, not endpoint authentication. I briefly mentioned the key usage attribute of the X509 certificate earlier, and certificates intended solely for email security will not be flagged for use in authentication. Certificates flagged for use in authentication will be much more expensive and never free. They also tend to have a rigorous identity verification that can take time. Last time I got one of these, it required me to mail them a paper document with notarized signatures from people who'd looked at my IDs. This is very secure, but there needs to be sufficient reason for the users to spend the time and money to get set up. In my case, it was a requirement for my job, and also my employer reimbursed me for the cost. The option you're almost certainly going to use if you really want to use mTLS for user authentication is to issue the certificates yourself. This is also how you get client certificates into systems using mTLS in a zero-trust architecture, using a local CA. I'm not going to go into detail about running your own CA or much of anything about zero trust because those topics deserve their own videos. Before we get to using mTLS for client authentication, let's look at HTTP authentication from the beginning. HTTP is a stateless protocol. That means that the HTTP server doesn't remember who you are from request to request. As a result, every single request made must include that authentication information. HTTP defines a mechanism called basic authentication. With basic authentication, The client sends a base64 encoded username and password with each request. This is rarely used anymore. Instead, we use bearer tokens. To get a bearer token, the user sends their credentials to an identity provider, which then sends back a token value. This token can be used in place of credentials to establish the client identity on subsequent requests. Another way to look at it is that the bearer token represents the session established after logging in. Bearer tokens can be issued securely, and they're often signed to prove authenticity. But like credentials, they can be stolen. Thousands of people have learned this the hard way thanks to some major breaches where the bearer tokens were stolen. The stolen tokens allowed attackers to access systems as if they had logged in with the victim's credentials. To be clear, the credentials were not stolen, only the bearer tokens. If you have a valid bearer token, you don't need the credentials because you've already hijacked a session. I'm not saying that it's easy to steal your bearer token, but if someone does, there's no stopping them from using it to gain unauthorized access to your account. You might think that mTLS also has a kind of bearer token, the X509 certificate. After all, the X509 certificate is something that you have to send to establish your identity. The difference is that when you send an X509 certificate, you have to prove that it's your certificate. When you send a token, there's no way to verify that you are the rightful bearer. You can prove your ownership of the X509 certificate because you have the private key that matches the public key in the certificate. This private key will never go over the network. It never gets stored in a vendor database. Frequently, it stays securely locked inside a hardware token, for example, a PIV card. This makes it virtually impossible to steal either your credentials or your session. Unfortunately, we run into a couple of practical issues when we consider using client certificates for authentication. The first is that it changes the role of TLS from an infrastructure element to an application component. In the last video, I explained that one of the big selling points of using TLS was that it didn't change the way your application ran when you weren't using TLS. Using mTLS for client authentication breaks that transparency by requiring applications to explicitly incorporate TLS. This requirement is even harder because in enterprise architectures, the applications often don't serve TLS. Instead, TLS is terminated at the boundary. Internal connections may use TLS, but this is often implemented by proxies that add TLS to connections in a way that's transparent to the applications. If you're terminating mTLS at the boundary, then it's the boundary server, not the application server, that receives the client certificate securely. The edge server can forward the certificate information on HTTP headers, but if the application can't verify the authenticity of these headers, then it can be easy for malicious parties to simply forge them. Amazon Web Service Application Load Balancers, ALBs, are a good example. They can be configured to validate the client certificate and then forward the information about the certificate to the application. For example, the certificate DN would be sent on a header called X Amazon mTLS client cert subject. If you could forge a request with the right header, you could impersonate any identity in the system, including one with higher privileges. Here's an analogy. Imagine if you had a security guard checking IDs at the door. People with valid IDs are given an internal ID for use inside the building. Imagine something ridiculously easy to make yourself, like a simple handwritten name tag. What if you figured out a way to trick somebody who was already inside? What if you could convince this insider to put on a forged name tag with the name of somebody important? Then, acting as the VIP, you have them do something malicious on your behalf. In technical terms, this analogy describes a server-side request forgery. In an SSRF attack, a malicious party can trick one of your internal servers into making a request to another internal server. If the SSRF includes the forged identity header, it could perform this operation as a privileged user. This scenario starts with a very secure authentication with a client certificate, and then turns into a situation where you can easily impersonate other users without even having to steal a token or any other credential. It's a huge step backwards, but it's how many systems employ client certificate authentication. You can still salvage this architecture by having the edge server create a JSON web token, JWT or JOT for short, that includes key certificate attributes. The signature on the JOT verifies its origin as the edge server rather than a malicious external request or an SSRF. Also, since this JOT is only used internally to the applications, there are fewer scenarios in which it could be stolen. This changes the guard analogy by introducing an internal credential that can only be created by the guard. Furthermore, it's easy for checkpoints inside the building to validate that an internal ID was issued by the guard. Even if you could subvert an insider, they don't have the ability to create a fake ID, so at best, you can get them to act as themselves, not a VIP. Maybe if you got a hold of an internal ID, you could figure out a way to use it. But since internal IDs aren't deliberately sent out of the building, they're hard to get. Even if they figure out a way to sneak it out, a short period of validity would make it difficult to use for any large-scale attack. Switching from the analogy back to the implementation, this means that each incoming request should get a freshly minted JOT with a very short period of validity. So where does this leave us? Authenticating TLS clients with X509 certificates is generally the most secure form of authentication you can use. If your goal is to make it easy and free for users to sign up to your site, however, it's not an attractive option. If, however, you have a known user base, such as employees at a company, it's an excellent choice. There are other asymmetric key-based authentication systems like Universal Two-Factor or Passkey. These are really good at protecting users against credential theft, but they don't have a strong identity binding, so they don't create the same kind of trust relationship. Personally, I think it would be helpful if people in the general public routinely had pre-existing X509 certificates that sites could expect to use for authentication. The easiest way to achieve that is for more state-issued IDs to include digital certificates. This is a bit of a hot take because a lot of people think this is a terrible idea. That's a debate worth its own video, but in my opinion, the benefits outweigh the risks. Is mTLS just another great technology that will never get widespread use? Well, no, mainly because it's a key enabler in zero trust architecture, but also it's already in use by millions of people. And even if we don't generally use mTLS to authenticate users, we can still use it to authenticate endpoints and strengthen the security of distributed systems such as clusters of microservices. This is not just for HTTP-based services, but for any enterprise traffic. Well, this wraps up the three-part series on X509 and TLS. I hope you found it educational or at least entertaining. I glossed over a lot, so there are many more related videos I could make. For example, I talked a lot about how certificate authorities are used to create trust, but I never really explained how that worked. I never went into details on what's actually in an X509 certificate. Did you know there's a version of TLS that runs on UDP? It's called DTLS, and I could do a video on that. If you'd like future videos going into these or other related topics, let me know in the comments. Now, here's some AI slop I created to add visual interest to this video, but didn't use. You'll see why.
Be your own encryptor and authenticate everything. Join the Root of Trust Fund now.
Yeah, that sucked. And thanks for watching.